Section 1 of John Inglesant, A Romance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. John Inglesant, A Romance, by Joseph Henry Shorthouse. Section 1, Introductory Chapter. During my second year at Oxford, I became acquainted with a Roman Catholic gentleman, the eldest son of a family long resident on the borders of Shropshire towards Wales. My friend, whose name was Fisher, invited me to his home, and early in my last long vacation I accepted his invitation. The picturesque country was seen to great advantage in the lovely summer weather. That part of Shropshire partakes somewhat of the mountain characteristics of Wales, combined with the more cultivated beauties of English rural scenery. The ranges of hills, some of which are lofty and precipitous, which intersect the country, form wide and fertile valleys, which are watered by pleasant streams. The wide pastures are bordered by extensive plantations covering the more gradual ascents, and forming long lines along the level summits. We had some miles to drive even from the small station on the diminutive branch line of railway, which had slowly conveyed us the last dozen miles or so of our journey. At last, just at the foot of one of the long straight hills called Edges in that country, we came upon my friend's house, seen over a flat champaign of pasture land, surrounded by rows of lofty trees, and backed by fir and other wood, reaching to the summit of the hill behind it. It was an old and very picturesque house, jumbled together with the additions of many centuries, from the round tower-like staircase with an extinguisher turret, to a handsome addition of 2 or 3 years ago. Close by was the mutilated tower of a ruined priory, the channel of which is used as the parish church. A handsome stone wing of 1 story, built in the early Gothic style, and not long completed, formed the entrance hall and dining room, with a wide staircase at the back. The hall was profusely hung with old landscapes and family portraits. After a short introduction to my friend's family, we were soon assembled in the newly finished dining room, with its stone walls and magnificent overhanging Gothic fireplace. The dinner party consisted of my friend's father and mother, his 2 sisters, and a Roman Catholic clergyman, the family chaplain and priest of a neighboring chapel, which Mr. Fisher had erected and endowed. The room was hung entirely with portraits, several of them being ecclesiastics, in different religious costumes, contrasting, to my eyes, strangely with the gay cavaliers and the beautiful ladies of the Stuarts' court, and the not less elaborately dressed portraits of the last century, and with those of my host and hostess in the costume of the Regency. I was struck with the portrait which happened to be opposite me, of a young man with a tonsured head, in what appeared to me to be very simple monk's dress, and I asked the priest, a beautiful and mid-looking old man, whom it was intended to represent. "A singular story is attached to that portrait," he said, "which, it may surprise you to learn, is not that of a member of our communion. It is the portrait of a young English man named Inglesant, a servant of King Charles I, who was very closely connected with the Roman Catholics of that day, especially abroad, and was employed in some secret negotiations between the king and the Catholic gentry. But the chief interest connected with his story consists in some very remarkable incidents which took place abroad, connected with the murderer of his only brother. Incidents which exhibit this young man's character in a noble and attractive light. He is connected with Mr. Fisher's family solely through the relations of his brother's wife, but, singularly, he is buried not far from here, across the meadows. In the latter years of his life he purchased an estate in this neighborhood, though it was not his native country, and founded an almshouse, or rather hospital, for lunatics, in the chapel in which his tomb is still standing. That portrait in which he appears in the dress of a novice, he continued, turning to the one before me, was taken in Rome, when he was residing at the English college, where he certainly was received, and he appears to have been generally, when abroad, into full communion with us. As a contrast to it, I will show you another in the drawing-room, by Van Dyck, which, though it really was intended for his brother, yet many equally well represent himself, as, at that period, the two brothers are said to have been so exactly alike that they could not be known apart. On his tomb at Monk's Lydiard, as you may see if you incline to take the trouble to walk so far, and it is a pleasing walk, he is represented in his gown of Bachelor of Civil Law, a degree which he received at Oxford during the Civil War, and he is there also represented with tonsured head. I have often thought, continued the priest, musingly, of arranging a considerable collection of papers referring to this gentleman's story, which is at present in the library, or at least of writing out a plain statement of the facts, but it would be better done, perhaps, by a layman. I have the authority of these young ladies, he continued with a smile, turning to the Miss Fishers, that the story is a more entertaining and even exciting one than the sensational novels of the day, of which, I need not say, I am not a judge. The young ladies confirmed this as far as their knowledge went, but they had heard only fragments of the story, and were urgent with the clergyman to set about the task. He, however, replied to their entreaties only by a shake of the head, and the ladies soon after left the room. When we went into the drawing-room, I was eager to see the Van Dyck, and was shown a magnificent picture at one end of the room, representing a singularly handsome young man in a gorgeous satin court dress of the reign of Charles I, whose long hair and profusion of lace and ornament would probably, in the work of another artist, have produced an unpleasing impression. But, softened by the peculiar genius of Van Dyck, the picture possessed that combination of splendor and pathos which we are in the habit of associating only with his paintings. His satin shoes and silk stockings contrasted curiously with the grass on which the cavalier stood, and the sylvan scene around him, and still more so with dogs and two horses, which were held at some little distance by a page. His face was high and noble, but on closely comparing it, as I did several times, with that of the monk in the dining-room, I arrived at the conclusion that either the likeness between the brothers was exaggerated, or the expression of the survivor must have altered greatly in after years, for no difference in dress, great as was the contrast between the coarse serge of the novice and the satin of the cavalier, between the close-cropped tonsured head and the flowing love-locks, would account for the greater strength and resolve of the portrait in the dining-room, combined, strangely as this expression was, with a slightly wild and abstracted look, indicating either religion's enthusiasm, or perhaps unsettlement of the reason within. This latter expression being totally wanting, is the face of the cavalier. The next day was Sunday, and I opened my window on a lovely prospect of lawn and water, with the fir woods sweeping up the hillsides beyond. Walking out in the avenue when I was dressed, I met the family returning from low mass at the chapel. I attended high mass with them at 11 o'clock. The chapel was picturesquely built higher up in the wood than the house. It had a light and graceful interior, and the covering of the altar were delicate and white. The exquisite plaintive music, the pale glimmer of the tapers in the morning sunlight, the soothing perfume of the incense, the sense of pathetic pleading and of mysterious awe, as if of the possibility of a divine presence, produced its effect on me, as it does, I imagine, on most educated churchmen. But this effect failed in convincing me, then, as at other times, that there was more under that gorgeous ceremonial than may be found under the simpler Anglican ritual of the Blessed Sacrament. After church, my friend, who had some engagement with the priest, accepted my assurance that I was fond of solitary walks, and I set off alone on my quest of the tomb of John Inglesant. I followed a footpath which led direct from the ruined church near the house, across the small park-like enclosure, into the flat meadows beyond. The shadows of the great trees lay on the grass. The wild roses and honeysuckle covered the hedges. 1,000 butterflies fluttered over the fields. That Sunday stillness, which is, possibly, by the echo of our own hearts, but which we fancy marks the day, especially in the country, soothed the sense. The service in the morning had not supplied the sacrament to me, but it had been far from without being the sense of worship in the quiet country in the lovely summer weather. In connection with it, seemed to me then as often the nearest foretaste we can gain of what the blissful life will be. As I went on, the distant murmur of church bells came across the meadows, and following a footpath for a couple of miles, I came to the hospital or almshouse, standing amid rows of elrus, and having a small village attached to it, built probably since its erection. The bells which I had heard, and which ceased a little before I reached the place, were in a curious turret or cupola attached to the chapel, which formed one side of the court. The buildings were of red brick, faced with stone, in the latest style of the Stuart architecture. The door of the chapel was wide open, and I entered and dropped into a seat just as the psalms began. The room was fitted in a style exactly corresponding to the outside. A circular recess at the upper end took the place of the chancel, lighted with 3 windows, which were filled with innumerable small panes of glass. The altar was richly draped, and on it, besides vases of flowers, were 2 massive candlesticks of an antique pattern, and an old painting, apparently of the Virgin and Child. The lower walls of the chancel and of the whole chapel were panelled, and the whole had a flat ceiling of panelled oak, painted in the centre with a sun with rays. Partly in the chancel and partly in the chapel, the surpliced choir was accommodated in stairs or pews, and the organ and pulpit, in elaborate carved mahogany, completed the interior. There was a good congregation, and from this, and from many tablets on the walls, I gathered that the chapel was used by the neighborhood, as probably being nearer than the parish churches. The soft afternoon light filled the place, gliding the old brasswork and lighting up the dark carving and the sombre narrow pews. The music was of a very high class, deliciously sung, and I found afterwards that there was an endowment especially for the choir, and that the chaplains were required to be musical. The service bore comparison favorably with the morning's mass, and a short sermon followed. When all was over, and the people were gone out into the sunshine, I began to look for the tomb I had come to see, and the chaplain, Having come out of the vestry, and seeming to expect it, I went up and spoke to him. I told him I had walked from Lydiard, my friend's house, to see the tomb of the founder, to which I had been directed by the Roman Catholic gentleman who resided there. He was well acquainted with Father Arnold, he told me, and took me at once to the tomb, which was in a recess by the altar, screened from view by the choir estate. There he lay, sure enough, just as the priest had told me, carved from head to foot in alabaster, in his gown of bachelor of civil law, and his tonsured head. The sculptor had understood his work. The face was lifelike, and the likeness to the portrait was quite perceptible. The inscription was curious. Sub marmo isto Johannes Inglesant, preceptor usque ad judicem latet, expectans revelationem florum dei. I told the chaplain what Father Arnold had told me of this man's story, and of the materials that existed for writing it. He had heard of them, too, and even examined them. "The priest will never write it," he said. "Why do you not?" I asked. He laughed. "I am a musician," he said, "not an author. You seem more interested in it than most people. You had better do it." As I came back across the fields, I pondered over this advice, and after dinner I asked the priest the story. He told me the outline, and the next morning took me into the library and showed me the papers. The library at Lydiard is a very curious room below the level of the ground, and in the oldest part of the house it adjoins the tower with the extinguisher turret, by which there is communication with the bedchambers, and with the leads and garrets at the top of the house. The room was large, and had several closets besides a smaller room beyond, which had no visible communication except into the library. But the priest showed me a secret doorway and staircase, which, he said, descended into the cellars. Both of these rooms and the closet were crammed with books, the accumulation of 400 years, most of them first editions, and clean as when they came from the binder, but browned and mellowed with age. Early works of the German press, Caxton, the scarce literature of the 16th century, all the books which had once been fashionable, Cornelius Agrippa and Cardan, 2 or 3 editions of Euphues, folios of Shakespeare, and the dramatists, and choice editions of the literature of the 17th and 18th centuries, down to our own day. Besides this general literature, there was a large collection of Roman Catholic works and pamphlets, many privately printed at home or published abroad, biographies of seminary priests who had suffered death in England, reports of trials, private instructions, and even volumes of private letters, for Lydiard had always been a secure hiding-place for the hunted priests, and more than one had died there, leaving all his papers in the library. No fitter place could exist in which to attempt the task I had already determined to undertake, and I obtained leave of the priest, promising to make nothing public without his approval. I had the whole vacation before me, too idle and desultory to read for honors. I had always been fond of literature and the classics, and was safe for my degree, and I gave myself up unreservedly to my task. I have endeavored, as Father Arnold said, to tell a plain story. I have no pretensions to dramatic talent, and I depreciate the reader's criticism. If I have caught anything of the religious and social tone of the 17th century, I am more than content. Geoffrey Monk, M.A. End of section 1. Read by Elijah Fisher.